There's a moment in every relationship when something small feels not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet sentence that lands differently than it used to. Most people ignore that moment. They tell themselves they're overthinking. They don't want to seem insecure, so they swallow the feeling and move on. But human psychology rarely lies. When someone's emotional world begins shifting away from a partner, the change doesn't start with actions. It starts with language. The words they choose, the way they frame simple conversations, the subtle distance hidden inside ordinary sentences. And one phrase in particular appears again and again when someone's attention is drifting somewhere it shouldn't. It usually sounds harmless. She might say it casually while looking at her phone or while getting ready to go out. Sometimes she says it when you ask a completely normal question. I just need some space lately. Now understand something important before we go further. Everyone needs space sometimes. Healthy people have friends, interests, and personal time. That is not the problem. The psychology shifts when that sentence carries a different emotional tone. When someone who once wanted closeness suddenly begins redefining the relationship boundaries without explanation, it's rarely random. Distance often appears first in language. Think about how relationships normally grow. When two people care deeply, their natural instinct is inclusion. They share stories. They invite each other into their day. Even small things feel worth mentioning. But when emotional investment starts drifting elsewhere, the mind begins protecting that new attachment. Not necessarily with lies, but with controlled information. Less detail, less openness, more privacy. So the phrase, "I just need space," becomes a psychological shield. It sounds reasonable on the surface, but it quietly redraws the emotional borders of the relationship. And here's where things become complicated. Sometimes the space she asks for isn't just about solitude. Sometimes it's about creating room where another connection can exist without immediate scrutiny. Not always, but often enough that psychologists studying relationship dynamics see the pattern repeatedly. Notice what happens next. The routines change slightly. Phone habits shift. Conversations become shorter. You ask how her day was, and the answer feels edited. Not wrong, just incomplete. This is not proof of betrayal, but it is a signal that emotional energy is being redirected somewhere. And the human mind is very good at protecting new emotional excitement, especially when that excitement involves someone familiar, someone already inside the social circle, a coworker, a friend, someone you both know, because psychologically, those connections are easier to justify internally. The brain frames them as harmless familiarity, even while emotional lines slowly blur. That's why the earliest signs rarely appear as obvious deception. They appear as subtle changes in language, shorter answers, vague explanations. And that calm but distancing sentence that suddenly appears where closeness used to live, "I just need some space." When you hear it once, it may mean nothing. But when it becomes a pattern, when warmth turns into guarded independence, when openness turns into quiet separation, that's when psychology starts whispering a truth most people don't want to face. Something in the emotional landscape has changed, and the words are often the first place it reveals itself. Another sentence sometimes appears when emotional loyalty begins quietly shifting, and this one is even more revealing because it hides behind reassurance. She might say it gently, almost like she's calming your concerns. "You're overthinking things." Now, on the surface, that sounds reasonable. Everyone overthinks sometimes. Healthy partners remind each other not to spiral into unnecessary worry. But psychology becomes interesting when this phrase appears too quickly or too often. Whenever a simple question is asked, you notice something small. Maybe she suddenly guards her phone more closely. Maybe she laughs about a conversation but avoids mentioning who it was with. Maybe plans change more frequently than they used to. So you ask, not accusingly, just curious, and instead of answering clearly, the response shifts the focus onto your perception. You're just overthinking. This is a subtle psychological deflection. Instead of explaining the situation, the conversation becomes about whether your feelings are valid. Over time, this dynamic can slowly train someone to doubt their own instincts. Each time they notice something unusual, they hesitate to ask. They worry they'll seem paranoid. So they silence the question before it's spoken. but instincts exist for a reason. Humans evolved to detect emotional changes in the people closest to them. Long before words existed, survival depended on reading subtle behavioral shifts in the tribe. Your brain is constantly observing patterns, tone of voice, body language, eye contact, consistency. When those patterns change, the mind sends a quiet signal that something is different. Again, this does not automatically mean someone is being unfaithful. Life stress, personal struggles, or emotional burnout can also cause behavioral shifts. But when a person repeatedly avoids transparency while labeling your concerns as overthinking, something deeper may be happening. Because healthy reassurance looks different. A partner who has nothing to hide usually answers questions with clarity. They don't mind explaining who they were texting. They don't become defensive over harmless curiosity. In fact, openness often strengthens trust. But when someone is emotionally invested somewhere they shouldn't be, even innocent questions can feel threatening to the secret they're trying to protect. So the easiest solution becomes psychological redirection. The conversation stops being about the behavior and starts being about your reaction. You're imagining things, you're too sensitive, you're overthinking. The goal may not be manipulation in a malicious sense. Sometimes it's simply self-protection. The brain tries to maintain two realities at once: the existing relationship and the exciting new emotional connection. And that internal conflict leaks into communication. Suddenly, simple discussions feel tense. Curiosity feels unwelcome. Questions create distance instead of clarity. The relationship slowly shifts from open partnership into careful navigation, where one person feels like they're walking through fog. They sense something has changed, but every attempt to understand it gets dismissed. This is where many people start blaming themselves. Maybe I'm insecure. Maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe I should just trust more. But emotional awareness is not insecurity. It's perception. And when reassurance becomes a tool for avoiding transparency, instead of offering comfort, the words themselves begin telling a story. A story about distance, about guarded emotions, and about the quiet psychological tension that appears when someone's attention is no longer focused in just one place. There is another phrase that appears in relationships when emotional priorities start quietly shifting. And this one is particularly revealing because it changes how someone talks about the future. You might hear it during a normal conversation about plans. Maybe you're discussing a trip, a move, something months down the road, and instead of excitement or curiosity, the response sounds distant. We'll see what happens. At first glance, that sounds harmless. Life is unpredictable. Not everything needs to be planned with certainty. But the psychology behind this phrase becomes important when it replaces the enthusiasm that once existed. When people are emotionally invested in a relationship, their language naturally includes the future. They imagine experiences together. They talk about we more than I. It's not forced. It's instinctive. The brain links the partner with upcoming chapters of life. But when someone begins mentally detaching from the relationship, the future becomes blurry. Not necessarily because they have decided to leave. Often it's because their emotional energy is divided. Part of them still exists in the relationship. Another part is exploring a new emotional possibility. And the human mind struggles to commit to a future when it is quietly entertaining an alternative. So the language changes. Plans become vague. Certainty turns into neutrality. Excitement becomes cautious distance. We'll see. This phrase allows someone to avoid lying while also avoiding commitment. It keeps doors open without directly closing any. And psychologically, that's very appealing when someone feels pulled in two directions. Imagine standing at a crossroads without wanting to choose yet. One path represents the stability of the current relationship. The other represents curiosity, novelty, or emotional excitement with someone new. In that mental state, making strong future plans feels uncomfortable, because deep down, the person knows those promises might conflict with where their emotions are drifting. So the safest response becomes ambiguity. We'll see. Over time, this subtle shift can create emotional confusion for the partner who still feels fully invested. They remember how conversations used to sound. They remember when plans sparked laughter, imagination, and anticipation. Now the same conversations feel flat, like the future is being held at arm's length. Again, none of these phrases alone prove betrayal. Relationships are complex. People go through personal changes, stress, and moments of uncertainty. But psychology reveals patterns. When multiple signals appear together, emotional distance, guarded communication, dismissing concerns, and vague future language, the relationship dynamic is shifting in ways that deserve attention, because healthy relationships move toward clarity. Even during difficult periods, partners who respect each other usually choose honesty over confusion. They talk openly about doubts. They share what they're feeling. Ambiguity rarely strengthens love. It protects indecision, and indecision often appears when someone's heart is no longer anchored in just one place. That's the quiet truth many people feel long before they ever see clear evidence. The language changes first. The emotional tone shifts second. And eventually, the reality behind those words becomes impossible to ignore. Here is the truth most people never hear when they search for signs of betrayal. The real question is not whether someone else has appeared. The deeper question is whether the emotional foundation of the relationship is still strong. Because relationships rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. They drift apart slowly, through silence, avoidance, and words that hide more than they reveal. When trust is healthy, communication feels natural, questions don't feel dangerous, transparency isn't forced, two people simply live their lives with openness. But when distance enters the relationship, even ordinary conversations begin carrying tension. A simple, "Who were you talking to?" suddenly feels like an interrogation. A casual, "What are your plans tonight?" feels like pressure. And that tension reveals something important. Not necessarily guilt, but emotional separation. When someone begins protecting parts of their life from their partner, the relationship quietly changes shape. Instead of two people sharing one emotional world, it becomes two parallel lives, occasionally intersecting. One partner senses the shift, but struggles to explain it. The other partner feels the pressure of being observed while trying to maintain normalcy, and both people slowly lose the sense of safety that once defined the relationship. This is why focusing only on catching someone often misses the deeper issue. Healthy relationships are not built on investigation. They are built on honesty, respect, and emotional presence. If those elements disappear, the relationship needs serious reflection, regardless of whether another person is involved. Because the most painful situation isn't discovering betrayal. The most painful situation is staying in a connection where honesty no longer lives. A strong partner doesn't chase clarity through suspicion. They create space for direct conversation. They speak calmly. They observe behavior. And most importantly, they respect themselves enough to walk away from constant confusion. Psychology teaches a powerful lesson about attraction and respect. People value relationships where honesty is required, not optional. When someone realizes they cannot maintain distance, secrecy, or emotional games without consequences, the dynamic changes. Either the truth surfaces, or the relationship ends. But clarity always arrives eventually. So if you ever notice these subtle language shifts, requests for unexplained distance, constant dismissal of your concerns, vague answers about the future, don't panic. Instead, pay attention, not with anger, with awareness, because the words people choose often reveal what their actions are still trying to hide. And awareness gives you something incredibly powerful. Choice. The choice to communicate. The choice to demand honesty. The choice to protect your own emotional well-being. And sometimes, the choice to walk away from a story that is no longer being written with you in mind. Now, I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever heard one of these phrases in a relationship and later realized your instincts were trying to warn you? Write your experience in the comments. Your story might help someone else see the signs earlier. And if this video opened your eyes to the deeper psychology of relationships, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a friend who needs to hear this truth today.